feeling? Good? I will be very brief because I think the conversations have been incredible, so I do want to go in and out. But I think the highlight here is that everything, as has been mentioned, is interconnected. No, all of these conversations are completely interconnected. It's not just about the economy. It's not just about voting. It's not just about abortion. It's not just about Iran. This is about our rights. No, it is about our self-determination, our self-respect. It is about our dignity, right? So I think just it's important to pay attention to those themes and those threads as you're thinking about what you'll do when you leave this room. And one of the coolest things for me has been that literally in the past 24 hours, I've met almost 4 women that were in Beijing in 1995 and that were present when Secretary Clinton was saying those, those famous words. And I loved hearing it because, not just because of their experience in the moment, but just thinking about the way that it fundamentally changed their careers. What it meant for them to be there when you were speaking and then come to this country and see the way that their trajectory changed. And I think that's it. Those words, women's rights are human rights, it fundamentally changed the way that the world views our rights. It completely created a new frame of reference, frame of work for us. And so we have to honor that every time. So not that you need to hear it again, but thank you. And that's what our next conversation is about. That's exactly what it's titled. Women's rights are human rights. And it is led by no other than Milan Revere. She is the executive director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security. And I mean, just obviously just an incredible leader. We all certainly stand on your shoulders, Milan, so just thank you so much. And she'll be joined by an incredible group of women. We have SHABANA BASIJ-RASIKH. She's the founder of School of Leadership of Afghanistan. Incredible, yes. We have HELEN KEZIE-NWOHA. She's the executive director of the Women's International Peace Center. Thank you so much, HELEN. And we have GAYLE TZEMACH LEMMON. She's an author, adjunct senior fellow for women and foreign policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you all so much. I can't wait to hear.
Thank you so much, Paola. And it is so inspiring to be with a room full of committed change makers, and of course, to be with our change maker in chief. And as Paola said, many of us, and I think our change maker in chief, and certainly me, were really transformed by what happened in Beijing. And I realized that happened 27 years ago, and there are many in this room who weren't born, or maybe they were toddlers, and don't know a whole lot about why we keep talking about Beijing. And what it was about was a call to action, what this has been about. And it was a call to action for equality between men and women. And we clearly have not achieved our ultimate goal, but we have been on the road, and there have been incredible gains. And so much of this was precipitated, and I should say, the connectivity that Paola talked about was solidified by that ultimate call to action. Once and for all, women's rights are human rights, not something separate from human rights, not a subset of human rights, but human rights. And so a platform for action was adopted by 187 countries by consensus. I don't think that could happen today, and we haven't had such a conference since. And there were tens of thousands of activists, including Elise, including so many other NGOs, perhaps some of you in this room, who heard that call to action and wanted to be a part of it. Now, what was in this platform for action? Well, women's access to education and to health care. That was a right. It was identified as a right. The right to participate in the economy of your country. The right to engage in issues having to do with the environment. We didn't know what climate change was then, but we knew we needed to engage in the environment. The right to political participation, still a struggle, as you've been hearing and as you know in your own experience. The right to women to be engaged in peace and security issues, something that has led to a lot of activity since on the part of the UN. The right to be free from discrimination, the right to be free from violence. That was the platform for action. That is still our call to action because, as you've also heard, it's an unfinished agenda. And I just want to say, having heard the discussion about Iran, that the cause in Iran is all of our cause. Those women, including the loss of life that Masa, that happened to her, so incredibly unfortunate, but it was the protest that it brought on is a protest of women saying their lives should not be controlled by the regime. And some years ago, when Hillary was First Lady, I had the privilege of going with her to South Africa. And we were at the prison that President Mandela had spent so many earlier years in his struggle against apartheid. And I remember we asked President Mandela, we said, did you know that in America we were protesting against apartheid? Did you know that we were boycotting certain things? And he looked at us and he said, what do you think kept us going? And I say that because the solidarity that we all express in however we manifest it with those women, now accompanied by men, with participation across the sectors, is so critically important. In Afghanistan, 20 years of progress is being eviscerated, and we'll hear a little bit more about that. But that too is our cause, and something we must not allow the Taliban to do, which is something they desperately want to do, which is make women invisible in Afghanistan. And when I think about Ukraine today, and we know this horrific war where Russia has no responsibility that it ever wants to incur under humanitarian law. And what that says is you don't attack civilians. You don't attack hospitals, schools, where people live. That is happening every day. And now the noose has been tightened where the attack is on the electrical grid so there can be no heat as it's getting colder and colder and only darkness. So this too is our cause because they're on the front line for freedom and human rights. And that's some of what we want to talk about now, and the connectivity among all of us in this room with people in other places, and they are deeply connected to us. So I'm going to start with SHABANA. And I remember the first time I learned what SHABANA did to be able to go to school. As a girl in Afghanistan who was deprived of that opportunity at the time, and today, Afghanistan is the only country in the world that is keeping girls from going to school once they've reached puberty, and they're now doing puberty exams to make sure you're not in school when you're not supposed to be in school. But SHABANA and her family so valued her education that they took what we might think are extreme measures, and she went on to create a school to help advance leadership in Afghanistan by educating girls. So SHABANA, your story is remarkable. There's been a lot of magic here today. I know you'll inspire us.
Thank you, Ambassador Verveer. And let me say it's such an honor to be in the presence of all of you and my role model, Secretary Clinton, and my amazing friend, Alida Black, who's been a great friend, especially in the past few years and most recently in August of 2021. I sit here as a product of the bravery of Afghan women, something that often internationally easily gets overlooked. When we heard those famous words from Secretary Clinton 27 years ago, around that time, education for girls in Afghanistan became illegal. I was 6 years old, and my incredibly brave parents decided that the greater risk was raising their daughters without an education. And then these brave women opened secret schools, inviting risk to their own families, running these secret schools from their living rooms. And it was in those living rooms, as small as the size of this stage right here, where I got educated for the first time. And I will never forget the bravery of those women and their families, day in and day out, keeping hope alive for young girls like myself, and for our families who are so determined and committed to education. And so it's no surprise, I hope, to all of you that when I was at the end of my freshman year of college here in the United States, I co-founded what is SOLA today, the first and only all-girls boarding school for Afghan girls in Afghanistan, with this idea that investment in girls' education in Afghanistan is the long game. We admitted our first cohort to SOLA after years of initially being a scholarship program, sending students here to the United States on scholarship opportunities to study, then worrying about brain drain and bringing quality education to Afghanistan by transforming the model to a boarding school. We admitted the first cohort in 2016 at 6th grade, right around the age of puberty, where there was a sharp decline in school attendance in Afghanistan across the country in remote parts, and boarding school model became this really tremendous opportunity to bring girls from rural communities where they didn't have access to quality education, teachers, and so on, to an environment, a nurturing environment where they were at the center, where their education mattered, they were valued, they knew that they were important and they had important contribution to make to their society. And we intentionally started that experience for girls at 6th grade, right around puberty, with the intention that gradually they will grow to graduating from SOLA High School. And this December would have been our first cohort graduating SOLA High School in Afghanistan. So we intentionally increased our enrollment every year. By 2021, we had girls, nearly 100 girls, representing 28 of the 34 provinces in Afghanistan, come to SOLA in grades 6th through 11th. And then the US government made an announcement to unconditionally withdraw US troops from Afghanistan, and I very, very quickly knew that as a leader of the only boarding school for Afghan girls operating in Kabul, that it was not going to be responsible for me to operate that school without jeopardizing the safety of our students. And so I would love to share some more later, but I will end our story in this particular instance to say that we were in an incredibly fortunate position. Beautiful global village of supporters, many of whom are sitting here in this room, who supported us when we decided to embark on a study abroad program for our entire school. This was way before the fall of Afghanistan to Taliban control, something that even on that day I found absolutely unimaginable. Our community of nearly 250 people were meant to be leaving Afghanistan on August 17 and 18 on chartered flights to Rwanda, where we are hosted for our study abroad program. And as you know, 2 days before that, Kabul fell to the control of Taliban, and our carefully planned study abroad program turned into an incredibly traumatic evacuation out of Afghanistan. I say that, but today, with all of that trauma, SOLA is the only physically functioning boarding school for Afghan girls in the world. And that thank you, but that's not okay.
Thank you, Shabana. And we'll talk some more about the situation in Afghanistan. But I want to turn to Helen, because Helen has been just an extraordinary activist in peace building and in human rights work, really across Africa. And we have in our midst President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who, if anybody knows what women can pull off, it is she. And frankly, it was the women at the grassroots level in Liberia who, after all of those horrible years of war, who mustered their strength, their commitment, went to the powers that be, said, you get yourself to the peace table and end this thing, and then surrounded the peace negotiators and wouldn't let them out until they did exactly that. And it's all portrayed in Pray the Devil Back to Hell, which is that extraordinary documentary. But then it was the same market women who propelled her to become the first female president in all of Africa. So the power of women at the grassroots level. So Helen, tell us what you see firsthand, what you know. I mean, today I work at Georgetown, where we're creating that evidence-based case on how women make a difference. We've got a framework from the United Nations on women in peace and security, but we don't use that experience at the local level to really inform the way we go about negotiating, ending conflict, recovery, et cetera.
Thank you so much, and I'm so honored to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to this space. And just as you talk about the history of Beijing, it comes to mind that the organization which I work for moved from Geneva to Africa in 1993, and 1995 went to Beijing. And while they were at Beijing, they discovered, because at that time, there was war in northern Uganda, but little was known about women in conflict. One of the critical areas was women in conflict. And that then determined the focus of our work. And that is how, since 1995 to date, we've been working and focusing on documenting the experiences of women in conflict and supporting them to be active in peace processes. So Beijing is one of those spaces that actually mobilize women around the 12 critical areas and determine the focus of the work that we are doing. So I'm so grateful to be here while we are discussing that. From my own experience, women generally are important in peace-building processes. However, like you said, despite the frameworks, despite the calls, their influence in peace processes has never really been recognized. However, they keep pushing. And I'm just going to share some of the experiences and why I think it is important for women to be in those processes. And I will start with this general theme that we have here today, that has been given, the gift that has been given to us. Women's rights are human rights. it is fundamentally the right of women to be at the peace table. We don't have to discuss it. We don't have to negotiate. One, because they make up mostly half of the population. But also you notice that we've had today in the conversations, women play different roles. Productive roles, reproductive roles, and community roles. We've had those experiences today. And because of those roles that women play, during conflict, it also imparts on those roles. So because of that, it's important that they bring their experiences in those different roles to the peace table. And you agree with me because research has also found, and you know, that in those peace processes where women were not involved, the peace does not last. The highest it could last is 15 years. And we've seen that. We see how countries that are peaceful or that are so-called peace relapse to conflict because they've not done the right thing. So women are able, when they're at the table, to bring social, economic, and political issues that could have been one of the root causes of the conflict to be addressed. And we saw that in the case of the peace agreement for South Sudan, where women were able to include 35% affirmative action for their participation in decision-making positions. Men never think about those things. Men think about power sharing when they are discussing at the table. It's about what do I get from here? But women do think deeper because of the way they are positioned within their families, within the communities, to then bring up issues that can propel communities post-conflict settings. So what we do see is sometimes we have these agreements. We have those provisions that have been provided, but it's still not being implemented. And the question we ask ourselves is, who is holding leaders accountable to the implementation of those agreements? So we set up, we have mechanisms that are being run by men, systems that are being run by men in power, and they cannot really push themselves. But that doesn't mean that women have not done anything. Women have also tried to mobilize themselves to be able to hold them accountable. So, for example, we now have special envoys on women, peace, and security. We have frameworks that are demanding for reports on what countries are doing to promote the women, peace, and security agenda. And from there, we move, we try to move forward in terms of asking governments to put in place laws and policies that can help women post-conflict. One of the most difficult issues we've tried to address is conflict-related sexual violence. And the fact that it continues to happen in conflict settings, and the fact that countries have failed to be held accountable and to have reparations for women who were raped during conflict, and how this trauma, and I was very happy when we discussed trauma, continues to live with women post-conflict and how it impacts on their ability to lead. And so interventions that have to address peace need to deal with trauma, need to provide women with skills for them to be able to speak up by themselves. And we find out that when you have provided the platform and skills for women, they are able to mediate, at their local levels. And this has really, been able to help to resolve conflicts at community level. So I'll stop there and we can
Thanks,
go back
Helen.
to it. Yeah.
I'm reminded listening to you about a friend who's a diplomat who understands completely why this is important to have women's engagement. He said the first thing the all-male negotiating teams do on both sides of the combat is give each other amnesty for what they did to the women. So we need participation by women for many reasons. We're going to turn now to GAYLE, who is, for those of you who don't know, a prolific writer and thinker. She's wrote a book, one of her earlier books, about a dressmaker in Afghanistan and economic empowerment. And I know we've had a discussion already on the economy, but GAYLE's going to tell us a little bit about how this grows economies, but even more importantly, how in the most difficult places, women can grow small and move to middle kinds of economic enterprises, so SMEs. So GAYLE, take it away.
Thank you, and it's such a privilege to be here with all of you. And I think it really comes down to me is that we can't count what we don't see, and we don't invest in things that are invisible. And what we count and who we count really matters. And part of the work I've had the privilege of doing is trying to really compel us to reshape the way we think about the investable universe across education, across healthcare, across the economy, across the security sector, and to realize that it really matters who and what we invest in. And I think making sure that the uncounted are counted and the invisible is visible is the work that we've been talking about all day. And it's truly a privilege. You know, I have seen in a lot of places that people count out in many rooms with power and water and light and fancy chandeliers, that, you know, those places far away. And I think truly, to the point of Dr. Clinton this morning and the point of Christy Turlington-Burns about it, our stories matter. And really, stories are the best inoculation we have against otherization. So I had the privilege of telling a story about a teenager whose business supported her family under the Taliban. And all of these young women who were breadwinners during years they couldn't be on their own streets. And I see it over and over again in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, in Syria. I was in Syria not long after Raqqa was liberated from the Islamic State, and met a young woman who was starting a pajama business. And she had with her in her shop a 15-year-old girl who had been nearly arrested by the Islamic State for walking between buildings to see her family not sufficiently covered. And she hadn't wanted to leave her house. She'd been incredibly scared even after ISIS was gone. And really, you know, the book I had the privilege of writing most recently was about the women who fought ISIS. And to the point of Dr. Clinton earlier about our artifacts, in the center of the town of Kobani is a huge statue to the women who were warriors in defeating the unlikely defeat, the first defeat that ISIS ever faced in 2014. So this young woman in 2017 in Raqqa was talking to me about her cousin who was standing there, and I asked her whether she liked to be in the shop. And she said, being here makes me feel like I have power again. Because she had been home for so long. She had been scared for so long. And here she was with her cousin who was starting this business, supporting her son, supporting her father, and championed by her father to keep the economy growing. And I think just one final fact on this, we don't have growth to waste. We don't have talent to waste. So when you think about all the money that's left on the table because we can't figure out how to make the wallet and the will match the words when it comes to women's economic advancement, you realize there's a gap there somewhere that we must step in and fill. And just one final note on this is Pakistan, you know, McKinsey did this survey about what would happen if slower countries that were less rapidly including women were to actually include women at parity in their economy. And Pakistan, just for example, because we were talking about its neighbor, you know, they were talking about that if you had Pakistan really move at the rate of the slowest moving country in the region, it would have $36 billion in additional GDP by 2025, right? We don't have $36 billion in GDP to squander. So let us get to work actually putting, you know, wallet and will alongside the words about how important women are.
Indeed, let us get to work. And I just have to say, as Secretary, Hillary spent so much time and effort really appreciating just how critical women's economic participation is for growing economies, besides changing the lives of women. Our clock's running down, but we want to do another round. And SHABANA, why don't you take us to where things are today in Afghanistan, particularly for girls, how hard it is given what is happening, and why it's so critical that we find a way to get them back in school despite what the Taliban is doing for the future of Afghanistan.
Well, it's very unfortunate for me to speak about Afghanistan in these terms, but things are not great. Initially, Taliban allowed girls to attend school up to 6th grade and allowed women to go to universities, banning access to secondary education for girls, which never made sense. And as the world gaze, especially the US gaze, shifted to Ukraine, they accelerated so much more to a point where today Afghanistan is the only country in the world where girls' access to education is illegal. Just a few days ago, they announced that with December being the month when a lot of university students take their final exams, that after the final exams, universities for women will not open. An announcement that they made just before young women in the country are taking their final exams for a final time. For the women in Afghanistan, the ones who really tried hard to remind the world, especially the US, that Taliban have not changed. There is no surprise that things are where they are. I hope none of you in this room are surprised. But why it's so critical to not look away from Afghanistan, to make sure that girls in Afghanistan go to school, that women have their rights. And by the way, women are also told they couldn't come to work, but instead they could send their male family members to take their jobs. It didn't matter if the male family members were qualified or not. So I can tell you that you cannot imagine what it means to be an Afghan woman today. And yet, the problems of girls and women in Afghanistan are not the problems of girls and women in Afghanistan alone. We unfortunately have a bitter history that proves that point. And we cannot afford to have a repeat of that either. And so think about what I'm about to say and see how many places it applies to. We have an unelected ruling body that codifies the control over a woman's body and their autonomy, and then handed over to men. And unfortunately, that just hasn't happened in Afghanistan. We know that. It's even as close as to this country, unfortunately, and Iran. They're all connected. We cannot afford to look away. And one final point about why it's so critical to make sure that girls in Afghanistan go to school and that women in Afghanistan are able to practice their rights is that today, in the face of all that difficulty, the targeted killings by the Taliban, the only group of people who have consistently, since August of 2021, have poured into the streets of not just Kabul, but the streets of Afghanistan, demanding their Islamic right to education, their Islamic right to work, to earn an income and support their families, are brave Afghan women facing armed Taliban and insisting that their rights be respected. And yes, they are also watching how the world is responding or looking away or not looking away. So I urge you not to look away.
Thank you, Shabana, because it is so important that we keep the issue of what's happening to women and girls in Afghanistan on that public radar screen. And these girls who are protesting are being met with the most horrendous consequences for doing it. But they expected a better life, and it was a life they started, and all of a sudden it was snatched away from them. So Helen, you have an interesting point that you've been thinking about. One of the things that many of you may have heard about is this call for a feminist foreign policy. We in the United States didn't call it that, but one of the things that Secretary Clinton strongly insisted on was that we integrate women's issues into all of our foreign policy decisions. But Helen, you're feeling that with a lot of ways that issues are messaged today, that there's actually been the co-option of feminist language that has undermined the goals we have for equality between men and women. Can you talk just a little bit about that?
Okay, thank you so much. And we watch from the other side of the world and do really appreciate the fact that there's this call for feminist foreign policies because we know that it will be an advantage that any kind of support that is going to developing countries address gender inequality issues, more specifically women's issues. We do find that many times the language that we have also used is being co-opted against us. So many times you find that there's a feminist foreign policy, but there's nothing within that policy that is really challenging the power structures, the systems and structures that continue to perpetuate discrimination and exclusion of women. The funding itself does not address or take into account what women can basically do with this. So many times we find some of the funding also going to big international organizations and not grassroots women's organizations that really don't have what it takes to access those funding. And so we keep saying, yes, we want a feminist foreign policy, but we want one that will really get down to women who are doing the work on the ground. So how can we break down those structural barriers that make it difficult for these women who are doing work, who are not really structured, like the big organizations, who don't have the capacity to write to use the right language to get the funding, but that this money gets to them to do the basic work of addressing the needs that they have to struggle with, particularly in situations of conflict and post-conflict settings. We do watch also from afar and say to ourselves, we would really want countries to support us to address our challenges, but sometimes we also feel that maybe countries need to also look inward. For example, I was so shocked, when I heard about the maternal mortality rate that, you have here, and I'm like, oh my God. So please, it's okay for you to come to us, but address some of the issues as well. So do invest in your own, the problems that women are having. And then when you come to us, we see you as role models who are also doing things that we need to step up and do. And we do know that we need the problem. But lastly, is there a way that these feminist foreign policies can set some kind of criteria for giving this money? So why do you give money to countries that are militarized, that have taken the rights of women, that have closed the civic engagement spaces, and yet you think you want to support us? It doesn't work because we're not able to do anything in those situations. So give money to democratically elected governments, to governments who have open spaces for us to be able to interact with them and change and influence policies, not governments that do not allow us to speak and governments that are ready to throw us off at any moment when we say things that we think is right in terms of protecting and making sure that women's rights are human rights.
And women's organizations get a minuscule amount of money from any of the big funders. So that needs to be rectified clearly for good reason. GAYLE, you have done a lot of thinking and writing about the disproportionate impacts of crises on men and women. And climate change is that existential threat of our time. It impacts all of us, but women are disproportionately impacted. Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, and I think also to Dr. Joyce St. John's point today, we talk about climate change in opaque language that absolutely leaves out the humanity and the shared humanity and the impacts it has. So 1.5 is incredibly important number, but there are some other important numbers, right? Women and children are 14 times more likely to die in disaster. 80% of those displaced by climate are women. Right? And if you think about, and I've seen this firsthand, and Pakistan's just the latest example in terms of the floods, right? There were regions of Ethiopia that were worst affected by drought. Child marriage was 119% more likely to take place. Right? These aren't just numbers. These are the ghosts of girls' potential that we will never benefit from. This is about all of us in a global economy that needs every bit of talent that we have. So those numbers are just as important. And to end on real hope and opportunity, there are two things that I think about sort of all the time, right? So the European Investment Bank wrote that women basically represent 43% of the agricultural labor force in developing economies, emerging economies, but they receive 7% of investment, right? And then if you could invest in female farmers with most up-to-date agricultural yields and technologies, you could basically up agricultural yields by 30%, which is the same gap that people feel that we're going to lose because of climate change. So we have a solution that is right in front of us. And I just want to end on a personal note. The reason why counting in so many people means so much to me is, I came from a community of single moms. My mom worked at the phone company when there was one phone company and sold Tupperware at night and taught us to go to work and the dignity of work in undercounted communities and the path to making sure that everybody is seen and heard is so obvious. And so communities of people who get together and actually support causes greater than themselves, which is what we see with women all around the world, especially in the toughest circumstances. That is our highway to hope. So thank you so much.
And now we're going to hear from a teacher, Kate Weckesser English, who is the Executive Director of Educators Institute for Human Rights. Open response now from her through the magic board.
Hello, I'm Kate Weckesser English, Executive Director for the Educators Institute for Human Rights in Washington, D.C. As a global community of educators, what specific steps can we take to advance the right to learn for women and girls?
Let's start with SHABANA, and then if anybody else wants to jump in before we have to close. SHABANA,
I think
this is your passion.
Yes, I think the shortest way I can make sure you remember my call to action is don't look away. I know there's a lot of demand on your attention here in the US, and yet it matters. It has consequences globally. Please call your representatives, your elected officials, and ask them, demand that they pay attention to the injustices towards Afghan girls and women, and then press them how come Afghanistan is no longer, and the issues in Afghanistan is no longer relevant to the national security of your country. It's very important. Please don't look away. Thank you.
Do either of you want to jump in on the education question?
Yes. So we've had the stories today of how girls have missed out of school because of COVID. And what that has done and what I see it doing is taking us 10 steps backward when we are talking about gender equality and closing the gap in education. And of course, this has an impact on leadership. Because when girls don't have education, then we also have statistics that women who are educated are more likely, not to die from pregnancy-related illnesses. But also when girls are educated, they have more potential to be in leadership positions. So I think that the right to education should be made compulsory. But also we need to ensure that girls have the time and are not being given home care work that prevents them from accessing school. And that in situations of conflict, for example, girls should be able to be supported to access education wherever they are, exactly the work that she's doing. Because once we don't do that, even in times of peace, we find that it's very difficult to close the gender gap. So right to education is fundamental to gender equality. Yeah, thank you.
I would say girls' education is the best anti-poverty vaccination we have. And we have to push for local organizations, exactly to Helen's point, who are on the ground in the most tough circumstances, who don't need hardship pay to be there because they're always there, right? To get funds to them to keep girls being in school and to keep girls getting educated.
If I can add to that, if I may, zooming out of Afghanistan, and also even because of COVID, we have now way more girls who are out of school. That's 150 million plus girls globally who are out of school today for various reasons. And their education is the lowest hanging fruits that we're not taking advantage of. We need them in school, not because we need to help them, but because we need their help to address all of these issues that we're talking about, eradicating poverty, addressing climate crisis, not global warming, but climate crisis, and any of these major global crises that we need to deal with. We need their help and their potential.
No, I always wonder why these ruthless men feel intimidated by a girl who's learning how to read and compute and so much more, because they know they'll be change makers, and one of the first things they'll do is get them out of power. Very quick lightning round, starting with GAYLE. Call to action.
Call to action is watch the discussions on gender from COP27, push for an end to child marriage in the United States and overseas, and make certain that those deploying capital in the private sector and the public sector include women, invest in women, and are women.
So experience has shown that women are able to build peace across religious, ethnic, and various diversities once the objective is peace. So I would like to request that you continue to advocate for women to be centered in peace building, and also to advocate to transform current practices within institutions that undermine women's leadership and their ability to participate in peace building, but most importantly, to provide protection for women peace builders, because many times they actually work in dangerous situations. Thank you so much.
SHABANA?
I risk repeating myself,
You may repeat yourself just
don't
so it
look
rubs
away.
in.
Don't look away. It's very important. Thank you.
And I would just say in conclusion that I have worried about using that word that Hillary mentioned vis-a-vis Madeleine Albright, about the fact that it's been said, calculated, computed, that it's going to take us over 100 years in any of these categories where we need to make progress for equality between men and women. And a few years ago, I co-authored a book called Fast Forward, and the only reason I did it was because I believe if each and every one of us examined ourselves and understood the power each of us have, whether as students or as power brokers in government or in C-suites, we could change the world and we could close this gap. So please know your power and help accelerate progress for women and girls. And thank our wonderful panel.